Hi, I'm Andy Mack, and welcome to Movie Shorts, the podcast where we take a closer look at the films everyone's talking about, and sometimes the ones that quietly slip under the radar. Today we're looking at How to Make a Killing, a film that sits somewhere between crime thriller and dark comedy. At its core, it's a story about ambition, resentment, and the dangerous moment when someone convinces themselves that a bad idea is actually a perfectly reasonable plan. What makes the film interesting early on is how casually the idea takes shape. The story doesn't begin with a grand scheme or some master criminal mind. Instead, it builds from small moments, frustrations, and the lingering sense that the life someone believes they deserve has been kept just out of reach. The question the film poses is a simple one. What happens when someone stops accepting that gap between the life they have and the life they think they should have? So let's get straight to it. How to Make a Killing is directed and written by John Patton Ford and runs for about an hour and 45 minutes. The film centres on Glen Powell as Beckett Redfellow, a man who we first meet on death row, explaining to a priest how a series of decisions eventually led him here. The story then moves backwards. Beckett grows up on the margins of a powerful and wealthy family. His mother had once belonged to the Redfellow dynasty, but was effectively cast out after choosing to raise him alone, leaving Beckett to grow up with the sense that he had been excluded from a life that might otherwise have been his. As a child, he befriends Julia Steinway, played by Margaret Qualley, someone whose life sits much closer to the kind of privilege Beckett has always observed from the outside. Years later, the two unexpectedly meet again when Beckett is working in a suit shop and Julia is only weeks away from getting married. During that conversation, the subject of Beckett's distant inheritance comes up, and Julia makes a flippant remark, half joking, half reckless, suggesting he should call her once he's killed them all. In a film built on dark humour and questionable decisions, that throwaway comment becomes the seed of something far more serious. The film clearly aims for a darkly comic tone, and you can see the appeal of that approach. Much of the humour comes from Beckett's calm, almost casual way of talking about what he is, after all, a deeply reckless individual. The premise itself had that familiar flavour of crime stories where a single bad decision quietly grows into something far larger than the person making it ever expected. But for a film that leans so heavily on dark comedy, the laughs are a little uneven. The moments that work best tend to come from Zach Woods, who plays one of Beckett's many cousins. Woods has a natural instinct for awkward, slightly offbeat humour, and his scenes bring a welcome unpredictability to the film. As for Glen Powell, the performance raises an interesting question, whether he's playing Beckett Redfellow or simply leaning into the confident, charismatic screen presence audience already associate with him. It's engaging enough, but it never feels like the character stretches far beyond that familiar Powell persona. The film also builds towards a confrontation involving Ed Harris, and his presence naturally carries a sense of weight. You expect a major moment when these threads finally come together. But when it arrives, it's over surprisingly quickly, and it leaves you with a slight strange feeling. Not just the scene itself feeling brief, but you're not entirely sure whether the film expects you to be rooting for Beckett at all. Without giving too much away, the final stretch of the film begins to shift its centre of gravity. Beckett, who has driven the story for most of the runtime, starts to feel less dominant within it, while Julia gradually becomes more central to what's unfolding. It's an interesting development, but the film never fully commits to that shift. Instead, the narrative begins to slow down, and the final 30 minutes feel heavier than the earlier sections of the film. Part of the issue may simply be the scale of the idea. There are several characters, complicated motivations, and a premise that invites deeper exploration of how these relationships evolve. By the time the film reaches its final act, you can't help feeling that the story might actually have benefited from a longer format, perhaps as a television series where those threads could have easily been developed more gradually. Instead, the film begins to feel compressed, and the energy that carried the opening act becomes harder to sustain. Tonally, the film starts with real confidence. The early sections embrace the dark comedy premise and allow the absurdity of Beckett's thinking to generate much of the entertainment. But around the halfway mark, that balance begins to change. The humour gradually fades and the film begins to operate more like a straightforward thriller. The problem isn't that the story itself becomes darker. That shift makes sense, but the comedic thread that gave the film its early personality largely disappears. Once the laughs stop arriving, the film struggles to replace them with a new kind of tension. What began as something playful and ironic becomes more serious, and the momentum that carried the opening begins to feel harder to maintain. What makes How to Make a Killing interesting is the idea at its centre. The film understands the strange logic people build for themselves when ambition, resentment, and opportunity collide. Beckett isn't presented as a traditional villain or a traditional hero. He's someone convincing himself that what he's doing makes perfect sense. And the ambiguity is part of the film's appeal. You spend much of the story unsure whether you're supposed to admire Beckett's determination, question his judgment, or simply watch the consequences unfold. Where the film struggles, however, is sustaining that early intrigue all the way to the end. The ingredients are all there: strong performances, strong cast, an interesting premise, and moments of sharp humour. But the film never quite finds the rhythm that would turn those pieces into something consistently compelling. It's a film that sparks curiosity even when it doesn't completely satisfy. How to Make a Killing. Promising, uneven, but frustrating. Thank you so much for listening to Movie Shorts. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider recommending this podcast to someone else who enjoys talking about films as much as you do. You can also leave a comment or rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. It really does help more people find the show. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Movie Shorts Andy Mac, and on Reddit by searching Movie Shorts Podcast, where I post clips, updates, and thoughts on upcoming reviews. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time on Movie Shorts.